In the early 1880s, Bolivia, Chile, and Peru fought a major conflict over mineral-rich desert lands in the western portion of South America. National boundaries were often unclear and ill-defined throughout that continent as countries began to liberate from their European colonizers in the early 1800s, especially in remote areas. The area in dispute between these three countries was a stretch of the Pacific coast located in what is now the northern portion of modern-day Chile, approximately between 23 and 25 degrees south of the equator. This area was remote and desolate and is part of the Atacama Desert, the driest one on the planet. This parched climate promoted the creation of substantial quantities of guano and sodium nitrate, which were useful as fertilizer and in explosives. Prospecting in the area began in the 1830s and expanded in the 1840s as the importance of these minerals to European nations grew. In 1866, Bolivia and Chile signed a treaty that established 24 degrees south latitude running from the Pacific coast to the eastern boundary of Chile as their joint national boundary. They also agreed to split tax revenues for mineral exports taken from the region between 23 and 25 degrees south latitude, but this arrangement was disliked by both sides and lasted for just 8 years. However, adding to the geopolitical tension was the fact that Peru and Bolivia signed a secret defensive treaty against Chile in February 1873. They invited Argentina to join, but it ultimately refused. In 1874, Bolivia and Chile modified their earlier treaty to allow Bolivia to collect all tax revenues for mineral exports between 23 and 24 degrees south latitude. However, this also came with a guarantee that Chile would not receive any tax increases on its industry and business interests. A conflict over the 1874 treaty arose 4 years later when the Bolivian government attempted to levy a tax against a Chilean company extracting nitrate in Bolivian territory. The Chilean government argued that such a tax increase was against the 1874 treaty, but the Bolivian government held firm. They seized the company's property in early February 1879 and planned to auction it off on February 14th. In response, 200 Chilean soldiers were transported by ship and seized the port city of Antofagasta, the center of the tensions, on the 14th. Bolivia declared war on Chile to the rest of the world on March 14th, with Chile giving its own declaration on April 5th. Peru was drawn into the war because of its defensive treaty with Bolivia and declared war on Chile on April 6th. All three countries were not prepared for war at this scale, though Chile was the best equipped of the three. Bolivia had no navy, and Peru's warships were manned by Chilean soldiers before the war, so they had to be replaced. Additionally, the two countries bought various rifles of multiple calibers for their militaries, which made wartime training and logistics difficult. However, they had an advantage over Chile in that the size of their combined armies was double that of Chile's. Peru also had the port of Callao, which contained strong artillery and provided a safe base for the Peruvian navy. That being said, Chile held some significant advantages at the outbreak of conflict. Their army and navy contained experienced soldiers and educated officers with up-to-date weapons. Additionally, they had a substantial advantage over the other two nations in terms of their cavalry and artillery forces. The first battle of the war occurred on March 23rd when 554 Chilean troops defeated 135 Bolivian ones at the Battle of Saltpeter. However, no further land battles took place until one side seized control of the sea. The Atacama Desert was sparsely populated and had few roads and railroads, so it would be difficult for any army to occupy territory and resupply there. Most support for a land campaign had to come from the Pacific Ocean, so the early engagements of the war occurred at sea. The naval campaign began when Chile blockaded the Peruvian port of Iquique on April 5th with two older, wooden ships, the Esmeralda and the Covadonga. However, in May 1879, two Peruvian ironclad ships, the Huáscar and the Independencia, moved out of the port of Callao to intercept them. Two major naval actions took place on May 21st involving these four ships. First, in the Battle of Iquique, the Huáscar engaged and sunk the Esmeralda after 4 hours of combat. During the Battle of Punta Gresa, the Independencia ran aground while pursuing the Covadonga and was abandoned. The results of the day were mixed for the Peruvian Navy. They had succeeded in breaking the blockade of Iquique and sunk the Esmeralda, but had also lost a powerful warship in the Independencia. The Huáscar continued to threaten and delay the Chilean Navy for much of the summer and early fall, providing a boost to Peruvian morale. Most significantly, the Huáscar captured the Chilean transport ship Rimac with 260 soldiers aboard in June 1879. The Battle of Angamos on October 8, 1879, proved to be the turning point in the naval campaign of the war as the Chilean Navy captured the Huáscar. The Peruvian Navy had lost its two most powerful ships and could no longer stop the Chilean Navy from assuming control over the Pacific Ocean for the rest of the war. Now that the Chilean Navy had control of the seas, their military turned its attention to land-based strategy. The entirety of the land battles during the war can be broken down into 4 sequential campaigns by the Chilean army over the next few years. The first major campaign came in November 1879 when the Chilean forces sought to capture the province of Tarapacá. On November 2nd, the Chilean military conducted an amphibious assault with 9,500 men on the city of Pisagua and captured it. They then marched south toward Iquique and met Peruvian and Bolivian forces at the Battle of San Francisco on November 19th. The result was a Chilean victory, enabling them to continue marching south to capture Iquique without further resistance. Some remaining detachments of the Peruvian forces assembled at the small town of Tarapacá, so the Chilean military sent a group to attack them in the Battle of Tarapacá on November 27th. The Peruvian forces won the battle, but were unable to capitalize on it and occupy the territory because they could not maintain supply lines to it. They were forced to retreat north to Arica through the rugged desert. The Tarapacá Campaign was a major victory for Chile, as they gained control over the entire province and mineral-rich lands. The next major campaign of the war took place during the first half of 1880, as the Chilean military attempted to capture the cities of Tacna and Arica. On February 24th, 11,000 soldiers of the Chilean army sailed from Pisagua and arrived at Punta Coles on February 26th, where they conducted a landing over the next several days with no resistance. The first major battle of the campaign took place on March 22nd, when 3,600 Chilean troops defeated 1,300 Peruvian ones at the Battle of Los Angeles. This severed the shortest supply line between the Peruvian capital of Lima and Arica or Tacna. The decisive battle during the entire land theater of the war came a few months later on May 26th, when the Chilean army of around 14,000 men defeated a slightly smaller combined army of Peruvian and Bolivian troops in the Battle of Tacna. This defeat ended Bolivia's involvement in the war and forced Peru to fight the rest of it alone. It also caused the Chilean government to realize that the only way to end the fighting would be the total surrender of Peru. The campaign concluded with the capture of Arica by Chilean forces on June 7th. An attempt at a peace settlement came in October 1880 when representatives of all 3 warring nations met for 5 days aboard the USS Lackawanna in Arica, but the negotiations were not successful. The third stage of the land campaign began in November 1880 when the Chilean military started planning its attacks on Lima. The first step was to capture the city of Pisco, about 200 miles south of Lima, to serve as a gathering point before further movement up the Peruvian coast. This was accomplished on November 20th. Throughout December, Chilean forces were both transported by water and marched overland to the coastal town of Chilca, about 28 miles south of Lima, in order to prepare for an assault on it, while the Peruvian army constructed 2 sets of defensive fortifications south of Lima at Chorrillos and Miraflores. The Chilean army was able to broach both defensive lines and capture Lima in some of the largest battles ever seen on the South American continent during mid-January 1881. However, the fall of Lima did not cause the Peruvian government to seek a peaceful resolution to the war. Instead, it ushered in the final stage of the land theater of war as they waged a guerrilla campaign against Chilean forces in the Andes Mountains over the next 2.5 years. The Chilean army pursued the guerrilla fighters throughout the Andes during 1882 and 1883 and fought several small conflicts. The decisive action came on July 10, 1883, in the Battle of Huamachuco. Chilean troops killed over 800 Peruvian fighters, about 1/3 of their remaining forces, and ended the threat of further guerrilla attacks. The Chilean and Peruvian governments signed the Treaty of Ancon on October 20, 1883, ending hostilities between them. This gave permanent control of the province of Tarapacá to Chile and temporary control of the provinces of Tacna and Arica for 10 years. The citizens of these provinces were supposed to hold a referendum after those 10 years to determine which nation they wanted to join, but Chile and Peru could not agree on the referendum's terms. However, in 1929, they signed the Treaty of Lima, which allowed Chile to keep Arica and Peru to regain Tacna. Peace between Bolivia and Chile occurred on April 4, 1884, when they signed the Treaty of Valparaiso, which forced Bolivia to give the region of Antofagasta to Chile. This made Bolivia a totally landlocked country, although Chile did agree to build a railroad between the capital of Bolivia, La Paz, and the coastal city of Arica.